Hello, my name is Hannah Skolton, and this is my video for Christianity 3333. For the assignment, I am doing my presentation on the Protoevangelium of James, and so I'm going to give a brief bit of context, and I also have some resources as well, some secondary scholarship. I have the book, The Non-Canonical Gospels, edited by Paul Foster. And so I got some context there, and then we'll actually get into a bit of the text. So to start out, the Protoevangelium of James narrates events prior to and immediately following the birth of Jesus, but a lot of the text really focuses on Mary's birth story, her adolescence, and then being raised in the temple, and then kind of how she is portrayed as this paradigm for purity. So Mary's purity and even Joseph's purity is a central theological theme in this text, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the Protoevangelium of James is divided into 25 chapters in more modern editions. It's much shorter than a lot of the other canonical and non-canonical gospel accounts. It contains 278 verses, and in Orthodox circles, the text has retained its title, its traditional title, The Birth of Mary, but often the appended description is just the Revelation of James. So it's mentioned in the writings of the early church fathers from as early as the first half of the 3rd century. It can be divided into 3 sections. It opens by narrating about the story of Joachim, who's an Israelite. He's very rich in profits around the temple, and he's very pious in his faith. And then it also talks about in chapter 2 about a woman named Anna who was lamenting in the beginning. She's lamenting because she was widowed, and then she's also barren, so she was struggling to conceive a child. The account describes her as being grieved and mourning due to her closed womb, but then she asked for her womb to produce life, just like Sarah prayed for God to give her a son, and then she was blessed with Isaac. One of the things, the central things, themes of the kind of comparison and like textual analysis of this non-canonical gospel is that there's a lot of parallels to the story of Samuel and Hannah. Hannah also lamented because she was barren, and then she gave birth to Samuel and raised him in the temple, very similarly to how Anna raises Mary, and then Mary's early life. So eventually Anna was visited by an angel of the Lord declaring that she shall indeed conceive, and then 2 angels came down and confirmed the same message to her husband. So Mary's birth is described in chapter 5. After 9 months she was born, and Anna was blessed throughout the process. Mary's upbringing and a lot of the narrative that, like, thus far mirrors, like I said, the story of Samuel and Hannah. One thing in particular I do want to point out is the blessing featured in chapter 6, where Mary's father says, "O God Most High, look upon this child and bless her with the utmost blessing which shall be forever." She is taken into the temple of Jerusalem and raised in devotion. When she reaches puberty and can no longer remain in the temple, the priest chooses Joseph, an elderly widower, to be her guardian. So another element that I want to focus on, the Protoevangelium of James is a lot more descriptive and a lot more precise in detail in terms of like the actual like dynamic between Mary and Joseph. They use the word betrothed, but it's a little different from how, in like contemporary American context, we think of like like 2 fiancés being betrothed, or a husband and a wife being betrothed. The Protoevangelium says that Mary gave birth to Jesus when she was 16 years old. Also, Joseph was significantly older. So one of the theological disputes and one of the main theological points of this non-canonical gospel is Mary's purity before the conception of Christ and even after. So when it talks about Jesus's brothers, a lot of speculation is drawn to this idea that James and his other brothers were actually Joseph's sons from a previous marriage. So I do have a couple of points here. So it seems to be that the Protoevangelium has no concern to defend the notion of perpetual virginity of Joseph, so Joseph's virginity, which was a theological novelty of the 4th century. However, at every possible point it reiterates and affirms the purity and virginity of Mary prior to conceiving Jesus, at his birth, and afterwards. And then this is without a doubt one of the most important theological concerns of the texts. Um, and so basically Gabriel announces Mary's forthcoming conception. She asks a couple of questions, and it is in her obedience to the will of God that makes her blessed. And basically that moment here of giving her will over to the will of God, that she shall bring forth the Messiah. And so chapter 11 dives into how she is the most blessed among women, being completely received by grace. And the text also describes Jesus' birth in a cave, which is different from the account of what we kind of picture, especially in like Protestant churches, of Jesus being born in a stable or a barn. They didn't have that back in that day and age. They kept animals in caves. And so there's also the mention of the midwife, and then how the midwife's experience when she actually touched Mary, she was rebuked, and then also the physical evidence of Mary being a virgin even in the midst of birth. And so we have this, this is talked about in like chapter 19, a woman from the hill country asking where they're going, and then there was the Hebrew midwife. And the midwife went in, she said to Mary, "Show thyself, for no small controversy has risen about thee." And then she didn't believe Mary. And then so when she went to check Mary, she was rebuked for her unbelief. And then she repents, and then she has this vision. And then the end of the Protoevangelium talks a lot about Herod and his pursuit of finding and killing the firstborn babies, slay the children from 2 years old and under. And Mary, having heard that the children were being killed, was afraid, and took the infant and swaddled him, and put him into an ox stall. And Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, having heard that they were searching for John, took him and brought him into the hill country. So both babies were hidden from Herod and his schemes. And then it talks about Herod's death, and yeah, so I know a part of it, why this account wasn't like added to the canonical gospel account. They just didn't like, I think the argument was that the early church didn't see why it was necessary, not for issues of salvation. It was more of a historical kind of account. And yes, so chapter 19 reveals the actual physical evidence of Mary's virginity during the birth of Jesus. And then it also adds the account of John the Baptist's early life as well. And so to answer some of the questions on the assignment, so how does the gospel present Jesus? It's just further affirmation of Jesus' divinity as well as his humanity, because you have the dualistic nature of the actual physical birth, and then also the fact that his conception was indeed miraculous. So it is that confirmation. But it's not about Jesus' ministry and his childhood. It is simply about his birth, and it kind of stops at that. This gospel does not talk about discipleship or the disciples at all, except for John. And then again, it's just kind of like it ends with Jesus and John. It is not, the focal point is not on really Jesus or John, it's on Mary and Joseph, and then Mary's parents, and arguing for Mary's perpetual purity, and then potentially even kind of her nature as well of being the most blessed among women, and then where the church gets their ideas about Mary. And then the distinctive, like I said, the theological contributions of this gospel is kind of what I just said, just confirming the providing evidence, historical evidence for who Mary was, especially her and Joseph's relationship dynamic, to prove the fact that they were faithful. They do go through a faith test, or a testing of their purity in this gospel. And then it relates to the canonical gospels, because you just have the further contribution of the story that we get in Matthew, and then just it's kind of a more in-depth description of that, which Matthew does not spend that much time on the birth of Jesus. And then John certainly does not open with it. He opens with the fact that the Son of God is the Logos. In the beginning was the Word, which is a lot more theological in its descriptions instead of just historical, kind of like what we get in Luke. So, yep, that's what I have on the Protoevangelium of James. It was very interesting to read. I really enjoyed it. And you can read it. It probably would take you like 20, 25 minutes, but it's definitely worth your time. Thank you.